My stepdad Shane floored it on a dark Alabama lot, tires screeching as I screamed for more. I grabbed his arm, the car spun wild, and his eyes locked on mine, hungry, alive. We weren't just racing. Something broke loose that night, and it wasn't the car. You won't guess what we couldn't stop. I'd been restless all week, stuck in our Alabama house with Mom buried in her office work, so I cornered Shane, my stepdad, a 57-year-old ex-racer who'd traded tracks for selling cars, and begged him to take me to an empty parking lot at midnight to show me the tricks he used to pull when he was king of the asphalt. He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck, but I teased him, saying he couldn't have gone soft after all those stories he'd told over dinner about outrunning cops in his prime, and his smirk told me I'd won before he grabbed his keys and nodded toward his beat-up Dodge parked out front. I slipped on a hoodie, checking that Mom was asleep after her late-night spreadsheets, and followed him to the car, the night air heavy with summer heat and the hum of crickets echoing off the quiet street outside our cul-de-sac. We pulled into the lot behind an old strip mall, its neon signs dark, the pavement cracked but wide enough for Shane to work, and I leaned forward in the passenger seat, telling him to floor it, to show me the guy who'd burned rubber before I was even born. He laughed, low and rough, saying I'd better hold on if I was gonna talk big, and when he hit the gas, the tires squealed, the car lurching into a tight spin that pressed me against the door, my pulse hammering as I watched him grip the wheel like it was an extension of himself. I shouted over the engine's roar, calling him a show-off, and he glanced at me, eyes glinting under the dashboard lights, saying I hadn't seen anything yet, his voice carrying a spark that felt more alive than he'd been in months around Mom's endless to-do lists. The car whipped into another drift, tires screaming, and I reached over, grabbing his arm to steady myself, my fingers digging into his jacket as the world blurred outside, and he didn't pull away, just kept spinning us, the lot turning into a haze of motion and noise. I laughed, telling him he still had it, that Mom would lose it if she saw us tearing up her boring life like this, and he shot me a look, half warning, half something else, saying she didn't need to know what we got up to when she wasn't looking. My hand lingered on his arm, and I leaned closer, teasing that he'd better keep my secrets too, my voice light but sharp, and he smirked again, slowing the car, the drift easing as we came to a stop, the air thick with burnt rubber and something heavier I couldn't name. He cut the engine, and we sat there, the lot silent except for distant traffic on the highway, and I twisted in my seat, asking why he quit racing when he clearly loved it, my fingers brushing his sleeve again, deliberate this time, testing him. He stared out the windshield, saying it wasn't about love, it was about surviving, but his hand stayed close to mine on the gearshift, not moving, and I grinned, saying survival looked better out here than in his sales office, my words hanging like a dare. A security light flickered on across the lot, catching us in its glare, and he tensed, telling me we should head back before someone called the cops, but I caught him glancing at me as he started the car, like he wasn't ready to leave either. Mom was still out cold when we pulled in, her office light off, and I hopped out, leaning through his window, saying he owed me another ride soon, my hair falling forward as I held his gaze a beat too long. He didn't answer, just nodded, but his fingers tapped the wheel, restless, and I walked inside, feeling his eyes on me, knowing we'd crossed a line tonight, even if neither of us said it out loud. The house was dark, but my chest buzzed, like the engine was still running under my skin, pushing me towards something I wasn't sure I could stop. A week after our midnight drift, I showed up at Shane's auto dealership just as they were locking up for the night, telling him I'd left my jacket in his car and needed it back, though really I wanted to see if he'd act different away from Mom's watchful routine at home. The showroom was dark, but the repair bay out back still had lights on, and Shane waved me through, saying he'd grab it from the employee lot, his work boots echoing on the concrete as he led me past racks of tires and a half-dismantled sedan propped up on a lift. I trailed him, teasing that he looked more at home here than in the suit he wore to sell cars, and he shot me a sideways glance, saying I'd be surprised how much he hated both, his voice dry but edged with something that made me want to push harder. In the bay, he pointed to a workbench cluttered with tools, telling me to wait while he checked the car, but I spotted a faded photo taped to a locker, him, younger, leaning on a race car with a grin I'd never seen at our dinner table, and I held it up, asking why he kept it hidden like some dirty secret. He froze, halfway across the room, then stalked over, snatching it from my hand, saying it wasn't mine to touch, his jaw tight like I'd dug up something he'd buried deeper than the lot we'd spun circles in last week. I stepped closer, not backing down, telling him he couldn't keep pretending he was just Mom's boring husband. Not when I'd felt that car roar under us, and he laughed, sharp, saying I didn't know the half of what he'd left behind, his eyes flicking over me like I was part of it now. I leaned against the workbench, crossing my arms, saying he should tell me then, give me the real story, not the cleaned-up version he fed Mom, and I let my fingers trail over a wrench, slow, watching him notice, my smile daring him to keep talking. He didn't take the bait, just turned away, tossing the photo into a drawer, but I caught his hand lingering there, trembling, and I moved beside him, saying he didn't scare me, not with his temper or his past, my voice soft, teasing, close enough he could feel it. He spun back, closer now, telling me to quit digging before I found something I couldn't handle, and I tilted my head, saying I'd handled him just fine out there in the dark, hadn't I, my words hanging like exhaust in the air. A clang rang out, another mechanic, working late, dropped a tool in the next bay, and Shane stepped back, cursing under his breath, saying we shouldn't be here, not like this, with Mom thinking he was finishing paperwork tonight. I grinned, telling him she'd never guess her star employee was playing guard dog with me instead, and I brushed past him toward the locker, pretending to look for my jacket, letting my shoulder graze his arm, deliberate, light, watching his hands flex like he didn't know what to do with them. He didn't follow, just watched me, and I asked why he kept that photo if he was so done with it, my tone playful but sharp, and he said some things you don't throw out, even when you should, his voice low, like he wasn't just talking about paper. The overhead lights buzzed, one flickering, and I found my jacket slung over a chair, pulling it on slow, saying he owed me a better story next time. My eyes locked on his as I zipped it up, lingering by the door. He didn't move, just nodded, but I saw his fist unclench, and I knew he'd be thinking about this later, same as me. Mom's car was parked at home, her office lamp probably still burning, and I walked out into the night, the bay door rattling shut behind me, feeling that photo's weight, like it had torn something open we couldn't close. 2 weeks after the auto shop showdown, I got restless one Thursday night and texted Shane to meet me at a dive bar across town, claiming I needed to hear a local band to shake off the monotony of Mom's endless budget meetings that kept her glued to her laptop at home. He showed up at the bar's gravel lot in his truck, looking out of place in a clean shirt, and I teased him as we walked in, saying he'd probably raced to worse places than this back when he was dodging pit crews and bar fights after winning bets on the track. He rolled his eyes, but the corner of his mouth twitched, telling me to keep it down unless I wanted the whole room knowing my bad ideas, and I nudged his arm, saying I'd bet he'd been the one with worse ones, my grin sharp enough to keep him guessing. Inside, the bar was dim, smelling of stale beer and sawdust, with a three-piece band grinding out covers on a tiny stage while locals crowded tables, shouting over the music. We grabbed a spot near the jukebox, away from the bar counter, and I ordered a soda, knowing Mom would flip if she caught wind I'd been anywhere near liquor, while Shane got a water, saying he didn't trust the taps here, his voice carrying that dry edge I'd started to like too much. I leaned against the jukebox, flipping through song titles, and asked him what he'd played on road trips with his crew, my fingers brushing his sleeve as I pointed to a random track, teasing that he'd probably picked something loud to drown out his losses, and he laughed, saying I'd lose that bet, his shoulder bumping mine, deliberate, like he was playing back. The band hit a rough note, and I asked why he'd ditched the nightlife when he clearly fit here better than at Mom's office parties, and he leaned closer, saying some nights weren't worth the crash that came after, but his eyes stayed on me, warm, like I'd pulled him somewhere he hadn't been in years. I picked a song, something old and gritty, and turned up the volume, telling him to dance if he still had the nerve, my voice light but daring, and he shook his head, saying I'd have to try harder than that, his hand resting near mine on the machine, close enough I could have moved an inch and changed everything. I didn't, just smirked, saying I'd get him out there eventually, and he raised an eyebrow, like he wasn't sure if I meant the dance floor or something else. A guy in a trucker hat staggered over, slurring that he'd seen Shane race back in '98, calling him a legend who'd choked when it counted, and I snapped at him to back off, but Shane grabbed my wrist, pulling me aside, saying it wasn't worth the fight, his grip firm, lingering as the guy stumbled away. I twisted free, telling him he should have shut that jerk down, that I'd have cheered him on, and I stepped closer, my hip brushing his, saying I liked him better when he fought, my words soft, teasing, meant to sting. He looked down at me, his breath catching, and said I was picking battles he couldn't win, his voice low, raw, like he meant us, not the drunk, and I held his gaze, letting the music thump between us, daring him to say more. The band stopped, the crowd thinning, and a bartender yelled last call, snapping us back, and Shane checked his phone, saying Mom might notice if we stayed out too late, though her texts were just work complaints, not questions. I tossed a quarter on the jukebox, picking one last song, saying he'd owe me a better night than this, my fingers grazing his as I walked past, slow, feeling his eyes follow me to the door. Outside, the air was thick, the lot quiet, and I climbed into his truck, knowing Mom was oblivious, but the space between us wasn't, not anymore, and I wondered how long we could keep pretending it was. A month after the bar, I was itching to get out again, so when Mom got stuck at a work dinner one humid Friday night, I called Shane and said I needed a drive to clear my head, knowing he'd ditch his late shift at the dealership if I pushed just right. He picked me up in his truck, no questions asked, and I told him to head to a lake I'd heard about, a quiet spot outside town where nobody'd bother us, teasing that he probably knew every back road in Alabama from his racing days when he'd outrun anyone chasing him. He glanced over, saying I was trouble for dragging him out like this, but the way he grinned, loose and unguarded, told me he didn't mind, and I kicked my shoes off, propping my feet on the dash, saying he'd thank me when he saw the stars away from Mom's porch light. We got to the lake, its surface flat and silver under the moon, and parked near a weathered bench by the shore, the kind carved with initials from people long gone, and I hopped out, telling him to sit with me instead of playing lookout like some nervous dad. He followed, easing onto the bench, his arm brushing mine as he stretched out, and I leaned back, saying this beat the bar's smoke and noise, didn't it? My voice playful, testing if he'd bite, and he nodded, saying he hadn't been out here since he was my age, his tone soft, like he was pulling up a memory he hadn't touched in years. I turned to him, tucking my hair behind my ear, asking what he'd been like back then, before Mom's schedules and sales quotas, and I let my knee nudge his, light, deliberate, watching his jaw tighten, though he didn't pull away. He started talking, slow, about a race that went wrong, a crash that flipped his car and his life, left him with scars he never showed Mom, and I listened, tracing the bench's carvings with my finger, saying he didn't seem like the type to crash, not the way he'd spun a lot like it was nothing. He looked at me, eyes catching the moonlight, saying I'd be surprised what could throw you off, and I grinned, leaning closer, telling him I'd like to try throwing him sometime, my words sharp, flirty, but soft enough he could dodge if he wanted. He didn't, just held my gaze, his hand shifting on the bench, close to mine, and I felt my pulse skip, like we were racing again, only this time there was no car to keep us steady. A splash broke the quiet, some fish or turtle hitting the water, and I laughed, saying maybe it was warning us to behave, but before he could answer, headlights swept across the lot, a car pulling in, loud voices spilling out as a group of teens piled onto the shore, music blaring from their speakers. Shane tensed, muttering we should go, but I grabbed his wrist, saying they wouldn't care about us, let's stay, my fingers lingering, warm against his skin, and he didn't pull free, just watched the kids like they might see more than they should. I stood, tugging him toward the truck, saying we'd find another spot if he was scared of a little company, my tone teasing, daring him to follow, and he did, his steps heavy, like he was fighting himself every inch of the way. We didn't leave right away, just leaned against the truck's hood, the kids' laughter fading as they moved down the shore, and I asked if he'd ever brought anyone else out here, my voice low, my shoulder brushing his as I turned to face him, close enough to feel his heat. He said no, not like this, and I smirked, saying good, I'd hate to share, my eyes locked on his, pushing just far enough to make him wonder. Mom's dinner was probably over, her texts unanswered, and I climbed into the cab, feeling the night shift, knowing we dodged something tonight, but not for long. By late summer, I'd grown tired of sneaking moments with Shane in parking lots and lakesides, so I pushed him to take me to the old speedway outside town, a crumbling track he'd raced on in his prime, saying I wanted to see where he'd been a legend before Mom's desk job clipped his wings. He resisted at first, muttering it was a waste of gas, but I leaned into his shoulder at dinner, whispering he couldn't hide that part of himself forever, not from me, and by Saturday evening, he caved, driving us out past cotton fields and rusted signs, the truck's headlights cutting through the Alabama dusk as I teased him about being scared to face his own ghosts. He shot back that I was the one stirring them up, his voice gruff but laced with a smile, and I stretched across the seat, letting my hand rest near his on the gearshift, saying I'd take the blame if he made it worth my while. The speedway was deserted, its grandstand sagging under vines, the asphalt scarred from years of neglect, and we parked near the pit lane, stepping out into air thick with dust and memory, the kind that clung to Shane's boots as he scanned the track like it might bite. I grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the stands, saying I bet he'd owned this place back when crowds chanted his name, and I hopped onto a bench, swaying like I was cheering, my laugh loud, daring him to join me, my hair catching the breeze as I tossed him a grin. He climbed up, slower, sitting close enough our thighs brushed, and said those days were louder than I'd like, but his eyes softened, watching me like I'd brought something back he thought he'd lost, and I nudged him, saying I'd have screamed loudest, my tone flirty, light, but heavy with intent. I asked what went wrong here, why he'd walked away when he could have kept going, and he rubbed his knuckles, telling me about a pileup that broke more than his car, friends gone, debts piled high, and I leaned closer, saying he didn't look broken to me. Not when he'd spun that lot like it was yesterday, my hand grazing his wrist, lingering, warm, as I held his gaze. He didn't pull back, just said I made it easy to forget the bad parts, his voice low, rough, like he'd let me closer than he meant to, and I tilted my head, telling him I could make him forget more if he'd let me, my words dancing on the edge, teasing, pulling us toward something neither of us named. The wind picked up, rattling loose metal in the stands, and I shivered, not from cold, but from how his arm stayed pressed against mine, steady, like he wasn't going anywhere. A flashlight beam sliced through the dark, a security guard shouting from the gate, demanding who was there, and Shane grabbed my hand, yanking me down behind the bench, his body close, shielding me as we crouched, hearts pounding, the guard's steps crunching gravel nearby. I stifled a laugh, whispering he'd better not rat me out, my breath warm against his ear, and he hissed for me to shut up, but his fingers tightened around mine, holding on even as the beam swept past, missing us by inches. The guard moved off, cursing about kids, and we stayed low, my shoulder pressed to his chest, his pulse fast under my palm, and I murmured that I liked him like this, on the run, my voice soft, daring, making him exhale sharp, like I'd pushed too far but not far enough. We waited till the coast was clear, then bolted to the truck, ducking low, and he started the engine, saying Mom would kill us both if she knew we'd trespassed, but I caught him smiling, like the thrill had woken something up. I slid across the seat, saying she'd never hear it from me, my fingers brushing his as I turned up the radio, letting the music fill what we couldn't say, knowing we dodged more than a guard tonight. 6 months after that first drift, Mom was away at a weekend work retreat, leaving the house too quiet, so I wandered downstairs one humid Saturday evening and found Shane in Mom's bedroom, kneeling by her nightstand, fiddling with a broken lamp she'd been nagging him to fix for weeks. I leaned against the doorframe, saying he looked out of place playing handyman in her space, and he glanced up, telling me to come help or quit mocking him, his voice rough but warm, like he'd been waiting for me to show up, and I stepped inside, teasing that I'd only stay if he made it quick, my grin sharp as I crossed the room. He handed me a tiny screwdriver, our fingers brushing, and I felt a jolt, knowing Mom's absence left us untethered, her usual rules and routines miles away with her conference binders. I sat on the bed's edge, holding the lamp base steady while he worked, and asked why he bothered with her chores when he could be out racing shadows like we'd done at the speedway, my tone light, flirty, poking at the guy I'd seen burn brighter than this domestic version. He paused, setting the bulb down, saying some things you do to keep the peace, but his eyes flicked to me, lingering, like I was the one breaking it, and I leaned closer, letting my knee nudge his arm, telling him peace didn't suit him, not when I'd seen him dodge guards and spin tires like nothing else mattered. He smirked, saying I was too good at finding his weak spots, and I tilted my head, my hair falling loose, saying I could find more if he'd stop hiding, my voice soft, daring, pulling us toward the line we'd danced around all summer. He stood, wiping his hands on his jeans, and I followed, stepping close, the lamp forgotten on the nightstand as I asked what he'd do without Mom's lists, without her keeping him on a leash, my words sharp, teasing, my fingers grazing his sleeve, slow, deliberate, watching his breath hitch. He didn't back off, just looked down at me, saying I was asking questions he shouldn't answer, but he stayed rooted, his hand twitching like it wanted to move, and I slid onto the bed, sitting cross-legged, patting the spot beside me, saying he could try me, see if I'd crash, my smile daring him to sit, to test it. He hesitated, then eased down, the mattress dipping, our shoulders inches apart, and I felt the air shift, heavy, like the Alabama heat had followed us inside, pressing us closer, tighter, until every sound, his breathing, the creak of the bed, felt louder than it should. I shifted, my hand brushing his on the quilt, and said he didn't have to play it safe. Not here, not tonight. With Mom gone and no one to interrupt, my voice low, warm, curling around us, and he turned, his eyes dark, locked on mine, his fingers flexing, almost closing the gap, the tension coiling so tight I could barely breathe. I leaned in, my arm pressing against his, my pulse hammering, telling him I'd keep up, I'd match him, like I had in that car, on that track, every time we'd pushed it, and he exhaled, rough, his hand lifting, hovering near my wrist, not touching, but close enough I felt its shadow, like we were seconds from something we couldn't undo. The room shrank, the lamp's soft glow fading, and I held his gaze, my chest tight, waiting, wanting, until a phone rang, Mom's ringtone, shrill from downstairs, cutting through like a blade. I froze, the sound yanking me back, and I saw her photo on the dresser, her and Shane at some work party, smiling like nothing could touch them, and my stomach twisted, guilt flooding in. I scrambled off the bed, grabbing my phone, muttering I couldn't, my voice shaking as I bolted for the door, Shane calling my name, hoarse, but I didn't stop, running to my room, packing a bag, and driving off that night, leaving the house with them, everything, knowing I'd never explain, never look back.